because I am not the right person to do this. Anyway, the intent of this panel is to give the chance to the guys here with me to explain their experiences in this. We have Carlo Comporti, that is the person that is truly inside the European rules. He worked for Caesar and now he's working in consulting firm Promontory. Sorry, if you want to introduce yourself, maybe it's better.
I'm a late draft. I think there was maybe a different perspective needed on the panel. But I'm Ian Salmon. I ran the MiFID program at Ferdinando. Some of you may know Ferdinando. Now working with a number of technology providers, but very much focusing on first MAR and then MiFID 2. And so we've got perhaps a different perspective on the market as well.
Okay. And hi, my name's Paul Burleton. I work for GFT. My background's actually operations, not technology, but I've been working on a number of MiFID 2 engagements around the city. So hopefully I'll have a perspective from a number of different organisations.
Yeah, maybe I would start with a question to all of you, but again, not acting as a moderator. My feeling going into the market that everyone are worrying about MiFID 2. Everyone would like to do everything soon, but no one is starting yet. What do you think in your experience? Is it a right feeling, or is completely wrong? Because I see a lot of activity, but no one effectively start to engage the problem with a very well clear project, very well. It's my personal opinion. Maybe I see Carlo that disagree.
Yes, I disagree, and probably I can
great.
Start, and then let's say we can rely. Let's say two remarks on what you said, and then I can elaborate later on the different points. The first is that you may be right in the sense that there was until recently the feeling of, oh look, this regulatory framework is not stable because there are still changes that are occurring at level 1 because the level 2 measures are not yet in place. So there was an overall impression that this framework is not stabilized. So why should I move if this is not crystallized? On this specific point, I can then, let's say, tell you where we stand from the regulatory framework point of view. And let's say with the most recent developments, I think that we're getting to a sort of crystallization. I can get to the details. On the second point, from at least the perspective that is now the one of the consultant, I see, let's say, most of the firms that have already engaged into, let's say, approaching the MiFID 2 project. So when I say most of the firm, of course, you can respect and you can anticipate a certain different speeds. I would rank probably in the first, let's say, in the front runner, the ones that had to take advantage. So making, as you did, presenting, let's say, some solutions, and particularly IT solutions that are now, let's say, discussed and on a daily basis with both buy-side and sell-side firms. Different components, but you would probably tell us more. But that is something that is happening. Then second ranking, I would say, are typical, let's say, the sell side, and I would say the investment banks have been moving, let's say, rather quickly, probably for the same reasons of the ones offering, let's say, solutions. And then the rest of, I would say, the third ranking of the global banks, with including in the picture, in their broad projects, not just the investment bank, but also the more retail-oriented private bank activities. And fourth, I would say the buy side. The buy side is, you see that there is a strong tiering there. The large asset managers have probably been moving rather advanced, and the other part is moving now. And then the last is, I would say, the more mid or smallish banks, more domestic. And they, for different reasons, it's legitimate that they take more time, because they probably wait for more national clarifications on the legal framework. They have less challenges on the overall, let's say, management of the project. So they're broadly speaking, they're moving now. And they're moving now to anticipate the budget by the summer for major changes occurring in next year. Having said these, from our perspective, I've seen that, let's say, in terms probably of volumes, most of, let's say, if you take from this perspective, most of the firms as a whole have been moving in the sense of establishing a project governance. This is up and running, and then I will tell you, I will probably go in more details about what the main challenges are and what the steps of this project are. But
no, I think I tend to agree. I think that the delay, when they announced the delay, I think it was a blessing and a curse, right? So I think a lot of firms obviously used it as an opportunity to replan, to actually, try and combine, work that they were doing in other regulatory spaces. I think that, so I think there's definitely obviously a positive angle to that, but there's also a lot of firms, if you think about the investment banks and the tier ones, right, had a terrible first quarter, right, they had to save costs, so where are they going to take that money from, right? So they said, okay, let's hold back on pushing forward with our MiFID 2 plans, let's make sure we get MAR and MAD implemented, and then I can see the resource squeeze coming exactly as you said, kind of like that August, September time frame. That's when people are really going to start to ramp up their projects.
Yeah, I think we've experienced probably only over the most recent 2 to 3 weeks, a massive level of engagement from, and as you say, mainly from the tier 1, top tier 2 sort of globals and super regionals. Most of them, as you said, have been trying to deal with what they think they're going to do with MAR, which of course leads us on to the next point, which is about the delay, because of course MAR is inextricably linked with MiFID 2 or the vice versa, and so most people's complex projects, if you look at most people's project titles in the banks, they're MAR, MAD and MiFID 2 program. So, the banks have been savvy enough to pull these things together because they're very interdependent. But of course, what it implies is that July and the MAR MAD sort of cut-off has consumed people's worries so far. The one thing I would say is, with the experience of having run a big project with MiFID 1, is that the engagement of the market and the belief that it could actually potentially change the way the market operates is there now, whereas in MiFID 1, people sat around thinking that this wasn't going to happen. Fragmentation, it might happen. It did happen, and then of course it took a good 18 months for smart routers and things to actually mature, and for the business models to mature. What's happening now is people are trying to preempt what the changes might be. So it's very much a start of a journey, and I think if there's a word of caution, it's look for the technology answers that give you the flexibility to see where the market's going and adapt.
Yeah. If I may, on this last point, I think that overall, in firms there is more awareness of the fact that MiFID 1, if I may say so, was more a sort of compliance-driven project. So I had to, let's say, go through this lengthy exercise with potentially with large European groups doing these X times as, let's say, presence in having to comply with different local requirements. Now, for two reasons. One is that the project is more European in the sense that there is a more coherent and convergent European framework on these provisions, and the fact that we are entering also into very wholesale markets, as you were discussing, how bond markets are different from equities. Say for these two reasons, I think that firms acknowledge and are aware of the competitive issues, and they want to move ahead, because it is not just ensuring compliance with these provisions, it's ensuring ultimately the profitability of certain business in an environment that is really affecting the way in which the organization of certain activities is happening. And one of the points that I'm making, say regularly with clients, is that, again, you should approach this from the European perspective rather than looking at, we have been listening before, the German approach. Yeah, there will be always, let's say, some rooms for divergences in the transposition of the directives, but most of the rules now are contained in regulations, so directly applicable. And people really think at exploiting the synergies that this framework allows. And let's say firms are moving ahead also because, let's say, they want to exploit these synergies. So a lot of investments on technology, on systems that would allow these synergies to be exploited.
Do you have any question on this item in the room? May I ask you another question? Maybe all of you. Did you have trouble in dealing with your customers, trying to figure out this threshold about liquid, illiquid instrument? Did you fall in the problem to describe to your customers how an instrument can be defined liquid or illiquid? I know that there are a lot of international committee still dealing with this. Am I right, Carlo?
Yeah, probably this gives the opportunity to recap of where we stand from the regulatory perspective, because it is very much driven by the most recent developments on the definition of the RTS number 2 and others. So I think that we got to a certain level of clarity about the delay. Now it's crystal clear, is 3rd of January 2018. Let's remind, also linked to what we were saying before, that these came as a request of the regulators to manage the, let's say, big challenge of crunching data that regulators were not able to do in a shorter time frame. So I think that there is an overall awareness of the implications on the data side. Okay, so it's good news that we have one additional year. We say, I tend to agree with those that consider that the project was since the beginning meant to be a 2 years implementation. But now it's formalized rather than being unclear about what would have happened in 2017. Now it's clear that it's still part of the implementation plan. Where I have doubts is whether it was a good idea to delay the transposition deadline, okay, for national, let's say, authorities. Because that would potentially reduce the certainty for local markets to, let's say, on the legal framework. Having said this, on the most recent discussion is, of course, on free RTS. Most, I think, is expected to be either has been approved or in the process of being approved. The Commission is presenting a correspondent table just to keep track of where we stand. On the specific liquidity issue, I think that the request from the Commission on certain products was to add an extra level of caution of not hampering liquidity with considering, let's say, too many instruments liquid from the first run. And ESMA, in the end, agreed with this phased-in approach. The only disagreement, and I think that ultimately, I guess the Commission will accept, is whether the progressive onboarding or progressive expansion of this phase-in approach will be automatic or not. And ESMA is making these automatic, whilst the Commission was considering these to be assessed on an annual basis. But broadly speaking, what we end up now is that on certain classes of bonds, the starting point is rather minimum, I would say, with a possibility to increment these as let's say the system goes on. I think that prudence is a good word here, because damaging liquidity and then recovering is much more difficult than starting with this incremental approach.
Like 3%, was that the number they came up with? The 3% of bonds would ended up being liquid in the new kind of calculation?
Yeah, I think that on certain, then depends on the kinds of bonds, but on according to, let's say, to data, we know that the difficulty now is getting full, let's say, the universe of data. I think that on certain, let's say, instruments, we're getting close to a dozen of, as a starting point of corporate bonds. So you see that depending really on the instruments, you start very low, and potentially these may increase. The same is not different, of course, to govies that are already to large extent liquid and onboarded on platforms.
And then just on that point, right, I mean, they obviously talked about a phased-in approach, and I think ESMA preferred to have a plan around what that phase-in would look like. Do we have any idea around what those timeframes might be? Or?
I think that the time frame that was envisaged so far is sort of 4-year plans. Knowing that from the experience also of MiFID I on shares, by the way, it's difficult to know whether the same path will be replicated or not, for the reasons that you, Nando, just explained about the differences between the instruments and how they are dealt with, let's say, in the markets. But it's a 4-year plan with a yearly review. And again, I think that we can always, all of us make, let's say, bets on expectations on what is likely to happen, but nobody knows exactly how this new market environment for fixed income will ultimately result in.
So there has to be a view of, there are certain aspects of MiFID II that even taking into account the announced delay, people have a natural tendency to sit on their hands and do nothing. And there are certain aspects, in particular, just relating to your question, in particular the definition of certain liquid or certain thresholds. These things have to be defined at some point. We saw the same problem with the SI regime within MiFID I, where the instrument set wasn't clear until quite late on, and it means people don't have the time that's required to actually prepare. And I imagine you're in the same position with the fixed income trading. Until you know what that definition is, you can't prepare. But the other takeaway from this as well is there are plenty of other aspects of the regulation where we won't have any further clarity. So a lot of people talk about waiting for the delegated acts for clarity on X, Y, Z, and actually, I'm sorry, they're not going to get it. So there are certain aspects of the rules which will be, or certain aspects of parameters which people just have to start preparing for right now, and even make some assumptions in order to prepare, because the lead time from getting any further clarity, even if it comes, is probably beyond where your IT project needs to start.
I fully agree on, in terms of approach, you cannot expect to have a clarity on all the issues. Probably at level 3, once all the level 2 measures will be adopted, at level 3 we will get these. but probably it will be a little bit late because the IT investments that are needed, say, firms need to start rather early. So I tend to agree on the fact that you should start making assumptions, and then if these assumptions are not validated, you have to go to a plan B. But wait and see is, in my view, is not an option.
You
But
cannot
then
wait to the next standard.
exactly. But then you still have, we still have to understand that you cannot make your case, for instance, if you are an SI or not, because you cannot have all the basis for the calculations because you lack certain important ingredients in this recipe that are the consolidated view of certain, let's say, market trading. So if you lack the universe, you may know what your part of trading is about, but you can still not make, let's say, the final determination of whether you are an SI or not, because you don't have access to the entire universe. And this will come, honestly, late, because ESMA will have to consolidate first. He's now preparing, the chair of ESMA went to the Econ Committee the day before yesterday, gave reassurance word about the level of preparedness of ESMA in this. But the final, let's say, availability of these data will come late. So again, it is not just legal assumptions, you have to make also market assumptions on whether you will be SI on which level of asset class.
This is why I point out that it's truly important when you deliver a solution to a broker, you need to be ready to change the picture with flexibility and cost effectively what you have delivered, what you delivered. Otherwise, is there any question around?
In terms of MiFID implementation, in market abuse and market manipulation, do you think there is an increment after the implementation of MiFID?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah.
In terms of market abuse and market manipulation, after the MiFID implementation, do you think there will be increase of activities in abusing the market or manipulating the market?
I can probably say two words, and probably this is a more operational question. To some extent, you may be, or regulators may be able to detect more hypotheses of behaviors of abuses, because there is more clarity under the market abuse regulation about certain offenses and certain behaviors. So the taxonomy and the indicators that MAR gives on certain behaviors is much more granular than it used to be. So I think it's more, to some extent, simple for regulators to identify certain behaviors and potentially enforce against these behaviors. For instance, just to be concrete, all the high-frequency trading, if you look at MAR, you have at least 5 or 6 different behaviors that, for the time being, were not codified, and now are clear: quote stuffing, pinging, layering, spoofing, all this. So whether the market will be trading in a more abusive way or not, is, I cannot say. But from the perspective of the detection, probably having more codification and taxonomy, that would help probably in making this emerging.
It's a little bit like the doping in sport kind of debate, isn't it, right? If you're catching more people, right, does that mean there's more of it going on, or does it just mean your testing is better, right? It's a similar type of approach, right? If you look at, since the LIBOR case, I've had 3 times the number of cases have been actually reported, how many have been seen through to a conclusion. They say, and when they put in MAR, that may increase, 2-3-fold again, right? Because the obligation on the firm is to raise those red flags, much like the AML debate, right? So AML, those red flags, they increased, 3, 4, 5-fold, right? Once you implement the regulation. So I don't know whether it's, is there more of it going on, or are we just catching more of it? you know, is the theory, right?
And on this vein, there is also, I think, the lady from Deutsche Börse alluded to this earlier. There is more capacity also of regulators because there is a massive record keeping.
Yeah.
The obligation basically to rewind, let's say, the trading, whether it is on an order book or another kind of trading venue, whatever the protocol, and the granularity in terms of timestamps, the clock synchronization, all these are ingredients plus the transaction reporting. Okay, that is different, but still they converge in enabling regulators to detect. Again, from the detection perspective, I think that there are more, let's say, instruments and tools that would be available. Again, when from the market perspective, you may expect more transparency, whether you may draw certain conclusions on more transparency, less market abuse, more market abuse. It's difficult to know, honestly.
The big change is in the rules around the intent. So, you know, capture at the moment, most people would survey on trades, not on orders and trades. So the intent to actually manipulate the market's a big part of Mars change. But I'd say actually, when you look at, to echo your point about the time stamping, actually what would be really interesting, having sat actually within an exchange in the surveillance area, the ability to look across venues is going to be where the detection is improved, because obviously for the first time ever, the regulator is going to have a view to microsecond accuracy of what's going on across multiple venues, not just in each venue. And that's very important.
Yeah. No, I think, I mean, just to finish up on that point, I'm a little bit cynical as to whether something like transaction reporting is going to enable market abuse detection. I have a feeling that ESMA still think that they're going to be drinking from a fire hose when they start getting all of that data, right? However, you know, the fact that you are going to be doing that transaction reporting and the fact that you're going to have to pull that information together, you know, back to your clock synchronization, back to your record keeping, the fact that you have all of that auditable in your organization means that the chance of it happening is much, much lower. And I think that's the intention of the rule.
But maybe in this scenario also, real-time market data before trading could be another aspect that has to be taken into account to anticipate any potential with machine learning or any other technology aspect. Could be another.
Now, Nando, here you raise a very tricky issue. That is, there is low latency, and of course, this is your business. In trading, but there is also a sort of expectation that is more and more visible from the regulatory side, that also the capacity to prevent and potentially detect any wrongdoing, and I take this word in a very broad sense, that it covers not just the market manipulation or market abuse, but also market integrity, with say the disorderly function of the market, the capacity to do it on a real-time basis. I have doubts. I think that the regulators clearly push for this, because for all algo activity, the sooner you intervene, let's say, the less say the harm you create on the market potentially, also from the perspective of disorderly trading, financial stability, and the like. But whether you need to invest, let's say, a lot on a sort of real-time monitoring, or particularly from the perspective of market abuse, I don't think that this is feasible. There are also certain, well, let's not turn this into a market abuse, but there are also certain behaviors that can only be detected on an ex post basis. You cannot always.
Saying you have to integrate maybe some aspect of the real time, of course, inside the huge amount of data that he was speaking about too.
I think there's an amount of real-time expectation that has to be carried forward from MAR into MiFID 2, particularly when you're, if you're a broker supporting, DMA links into multiple venues, I don't think there's very much that protects you from having to have real-time monitoring. The operational areas that sit within the banks now look very much like the surveillance and operational areas that lived within the exchanges up until this point, because they're the gateway to the flow into the market. But the point you're making is really interesting, which is, and everyone's made it at some point in this section, is the vast amount of data that's going to be consumed and stored. And actually, one of the areas that we see a lot of challenge coming, or one of the big challenges that seem to be coming from actually a lot of the larger banks, particularly those that think they're going to be SIs and MTFs, is actually the ability to capture that data and replay it, because it's actually a massive technical challenge.
Yeah. I think everywhere you look, you've got data issues. I think when I was thinking about, sitting on this panel, I was thinking, essentially MiFID 2 is a big data project. And I don't mean a big data project, I mean a big data project, right? It's or either, right? Yeah. Client data, right? Classification, single client list, et cetera, right? Product data, we already talked about liquidity, but just the identifier issue, right? Just getting identifiers right is a massive cause of concern. And then obviously you've talked about price and trade data, we've talked about transaction data, we've talked about record keeping, all of that data, and then not only having all that data, but being able to tie it all together, right? That's the other big kind of challenge that we're seeing across all of our clients.
The obligation that you have to demonstrate what you have done implies that you store a huge amount of tick by tick from different venues what we have gathered in order to show in real time to your customer. You're right.
Just that traceability,
good point.
Right? The traceability, being able to prove that you did what you did for the right reasons, right?
Yeah.
And this is true not just from, let's say, here we are looking at the more market activities. It's also, let's say, true for the other side of MiFID, that is a more investor-related or client-related, let's say, relationship, where from the perspective of a phone conversation, let's say, information on cost and charges that should be given ahead of each transaction, let's say, the traceability is it's an important element. Ultimately, also to protect, I think, firms to be able to demonstrate.
As I said before, we rank any counterpart. What price is giving to me, and every time I ask, and then has to be tracked in order to understand if I have to continue or not.
Absolutely.
Anyway, are there any other questions? No?
Okay.
Do you want to add something before closing?
No, I mean, we talked a lot about the data. We talked about some of the investor protection streams. I mean, obviously, we focus very much here on trading, technologies, etc. Right? And another observation that I wrote down here, working in a technology firm and a technology consultancy, so many of the project plans and so much of the PMO that I see from organisations is still very waterfall. Mm-hmm. You talked about flexibility. You talked about being able to react to changes, right? So many firms are still, should we be more agile? Should we be able to react more? A lot of regulators that I've spoken to over the years are quite happy with agile plans as long as you've got that traceability, right? And you can prove that you're doing what you're doing. I just, if I see another traceability spreadsheet or another PowerPoint deck, then I think I'm probably just going to kill myself. So that's my view. That's my view. So just for the record.
It's an interesting. Just as a sum up, then, because I kind of had a similar thought, not to kill myself, but was that this is actually everybody looks at this as a if you look at MiFID 2 and all the let's face it, most of us are sitting in the midst of a whole number of different regulations that that impact us, and we still haven't sort of recovered from EMIR and the transaction reporting challenges. But this is actually it's not solely an IT problem, it's not solely a governance problem, but a gentleman that stood up from Paribas, Kim Tan, stood up from Paribas at a recent conference and said, this is actually a people problem, because even if, when we've got our PMO sorted and we've got our project plan and we realise what we've got to achieve, take out of that the fact that it's going to actually change direction as we go along, we still haven't got enough people to actually build it in time. And so his word of caution, or his takeaway from that, and I applaud it really, is look out at what's out there in terms of solutions, in terms of clever technologies, in terms of help that you can gain from actually very, very dedicated resources, and learn from them, because I think that's the only way that anybody of a size is going to actually cope with the market change, because the market change is going to be significant.
Yeah, and I think actually sharing resource and being able to leverage each other is also another thing that you need to think about in that space.
Now, just to add, probably from a different perspective, and to reconnect this to our starting point, where we see, say, firms in the project now, at least the ones that were in the first 2 or 3 upper tiers. I think there is after the initial stage of understanding the potential implications, and after, let's say, taking aside the ones that knew exactly where to go and making proposals, on the sell side, there is still, say, largely the attempt to understand the positioning. And this positioning is honestly difficult to be determined, because it's the result of 2 different factors. Is one, what I want to become, given the new, let's say, MiFID II environment. For instance, I may decide also not to be an SI, a systematic analysis, if I systematically trade above, let's say, the SSTI. Just to give some very concrete examples on how I could potentially escape from also the most evident, let's say, obligation that is quoting and publishing prices as an SI. And the second, let's say, factor is purely external. So how likely the market structure on fixed income is evolving. As I said, in my view, it's difficult that this will follow the equity path of MiFID I. There may be some trends. Nobody knows whether the spreads will tighten, whether will be widened because of recognition of more market risk. There will be more electronic trading. Many platforms will become MTFs for legal compliance or commercial choice. There will be a progressive onboarding due to the trading obligation. So you see that even if you wanted to make to determine your own position, you have to make a lot of, let's say, assumptions that ultimately is difficult to determine. And that is where large firms are. So you have to move and to make the conditions to comply with NSI, even if you don't know exactly the universe under which you will have. You are contacting the APAs, the APAs, for, let's say, potentially pushing your post-trade information. You are contacting ARMS for the transaction reporting and other services. but the individual positioning is still unclear. So that is where I think that most of, let's say, the market is about, in parallel with let's say, the challenge of understanding what every single word in the legal text mean. And that is, there are two challenges that are running in parallel and are, let's say, progressively building the path for the MiFID II projects.
Yeah, it's a journey.
The journey is, yeah, it's a long journey.
Okay. Thank you, my hosts. Thank you to everyone.